Have you checked the children? Your little mess
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Horror Show. I'm Cecil, Laird, and horror video games are a hell of a thing, aren't they? They've been in production for almost as long as gaming has been around, and much like films of the same genre, they tend to offer very unique experiences within their worlds. While many video games try to be stress relievers, collectathons, or just plain time wasters, horror games could play with all the same ideas and tropes, but they always had an undercurrent of terror to them. Many horror video games even became so popular that they garnered film adaptations. Some even got multiple adaptations, and fewer still got multiple sequels over the course of many years. But does that mean that all the horror games that could make the best movies have been mined at this point? Or are there some that would make for genuinely good film experiences, but nobody has been willing to take the risk on them yet? My opinion, clearly by the video title, is the latter. So that's what I'm going to get into today. See, I've been playing horror video games my whole life, and I've been watching horror movies for just as long, if not a tiny bit longer, and it's always done my heart good to see some of my favorite scary properties be brought to the big screen, even if there have been some, let's call them varying results. And quite frankly, the number of video games that have already been adapted is pretty staggering. However, there are plenty of games that have been overlooked in that arena. And if not overlooked necessarily, then at least considered, but just never followed through on. But more likely, they've just been overlooked by the people in the positions to actually bring these things to life. And unfortunately, I'm not one of those people either, but I am someone with a modest platform and an audience, so maybe I can bring up a few games that people would agree would make great movies, and then you guys, the viewers, can take the ball and run with it, spreading the video around, and hopefully getting at least one of those affluent ears to hear it. Now before I get started, I want to make note that I would have included games like The Last of Us and Five Nights at Freddy's on this list, except for the fact that they are already getting adaptations at this point, at least right now, supposedly. A Five Nights at Freddy's movie has been in production at Warner Brothers for a few years now, but they seem to keep running into issues along the way, so the movie's production keeps getting pushed back. And The Last of Us was most recently announced to be in production as a TV show by the same guy that was behind the terrifying HBO telling of the real-life disaster, Chernobyl. So if any of my picks do have someone working on them as films, I am not aware of it as of recording this video. Also, I'm aware that some of my picks are probably impossible to actually make into films just because of the who controls the rights issues or who the rights holders would even allow this issues. So I acknowledge that going in, but that doesn't mean these games wouldn't make great movies. So they're on the list. And guys, if you like the style of this video, let me know that in the comments down below. And while you're down there, click the like button and subscribe so you don't miss further installments of this. If you guys do enjoy this, I can make it a series going forward. And trust me, there are lots of horror video games that I could talk about being made into films. That all being said, let's get into my top 6 horror games most in need of film adaptations. Why 6?
Because the number of the beast!
Naturally. Enjoy! So I'm going to be honest with you guys, my number 6 game mainly made it to the list because of my nostalgia goggles for it, and that's 1995's Sierra powerhouse, Phantasmagoria. Now, I haven't played Phantasmagoria probably since it came out about 25 years ago, and admittedly, not a whole lot about it holds up, but it still remained in my head, along with Mortal Kombat and Doom, as one of my earliest and most formative experiences with horror in video games. It was my second ever horror point-and-click adventure after The Seventh Guest, which was really more of a mystery game ultimately. But Phantasmagoria and its sequel, Phantasmagoria: A Puzzle of Flesh, leaned much more into the horror genre. The story centered around writer Adrienne Delaney and her husband Don as they moved to a huge mansion formerly owned by a well-known illusionist named Zoltan. And if you couldn't tell, the story is told through pre-recorded full-motion video against pre-rendered backgrounds. At the time, it was pretty groundbreaking because people were used to games looking like this. Or on the horror side of things, like this. So while it doesn't hold up well now, imagine what a 15-year-old Cecil would think of seeing real people interact with video game environments. Anyway, Adrian starts to uncover the truth about the illusionist and his wives, who were said to have been killed by him after he'd supposedly been possessed by a demon. Then, as she explores the massive estate, she finds a rundown chapel and mistakenly frees the demon, who immediately possesses her husband and starts haunting the grounds. From there, Adrian slowly starts to realize what she's done and dives deeper into the home and the surrounding area's history to uncover the truth behind it all. As I mentioned, the game is a point-and-click adventure, so it's not the fastest-paced game I've ever played, but the pacing was crafted to make the story into more of a mystery with many horror elements rather than anything else, and mysteries can move slowly. But as things progress, more and more crazy stuff happens, ultimately culminating with a direct and emotional showdown between Adrian and her husband that had the most horrific element of the whole game, the consequence for not choosing the right path. The reason I think it would make for a good horror movie nowadays is basically the story. It always captured my attention. So much so that the slow pacing never bothered me because I was enthralled with figuring everything out. And being a fan of horror of all types, the more B-movie elements, like the hammy acting and at times effects, didn't really bother me.
Oh, come on, you gotta help Ma!
Help! Help me! Oh, God.
Ma! I went and got that lady!
The story, however, I maintain, is worth revisiting in a more modern way. Just imagine, a married couple moves into this unbelievable mansion that was once owned by a demon-worshipping illusionist. As our protagonist's wife begins to explore, she accidentally unleashes something that haunts not only the house, but possesses her husband and slowly drives him mad, driving him to horrific acts of violence towards the end. I mean, the majority of that plot sounds pretty familiar, so I'm sure it would play as a film. And that's especially true when you add the illusionist angle and hidden passageways and secrets all over the mansion. There could be crazy traps that aren't what they seem, cool reveals via the passageways and hidden areas, and opportunities to impress with production design and art direction every step of the way. I even think it would be a good idea to bring back the original music composer for the game to do the film score as well. That was always something about the game that really impressed me, and one track in particular brings on one of the largest nostalgia highs that I tend to experience. I mean, just listen to this awesomeness. So really, all you have to do is make sure the acting, location, and effects all play as well as the story, and I think you have the makings of a really classic horror movie. Plus, it's one of the most badass titles of a horror property ever. You release a movie titled Phantasmagoria, and people are gonna see that shit. So the next game on the list is a survival horror action game set in space with monsters. I mean, what else could you ask for, right? Well, 2008's Dead Space fulfilled a need that I didn't frankly even know that I had. Combining excellent visuals at the time, tight gameplay, genuine tension and terror, and creative, Thing-esque monster designs made for a horror fan's dream of a game in 2008's Dead Space. In a universe where a war for resources on Earth ruined the planet and left the human race struggling to survive, Dead Space tells the story of Isaac Clarke, a member of the rescue team dispatched to assist the disabled space mining vessel Ishimura. The rescue team accidentally crashes into the Ishimura, leaving them stranded, searching for a way to restore power to the ship. Once they do, they realize something's happened to the previous crew, turning them all into bloodthirsty monsters straight out of John Carpenter's The Thing. So Isaac then has to scour the ship, performing repairs all along the way, while being hunted by numerous murderous creatures they call the necromorphs. As the story progresses, we find out just how the creatures were created and how it all ties in with the Ishimura's captain and his obsession with an alien artifact called the Red Marker. Now, technically there have been 2 Dead Space movies already, with 2008's Downfall, which was a prequel to the first game, and 2011's Aftermath, which bridged the first 2 games. But even though both movies were very gory and actually pretty solid overall, it's just not the same as a live-action treatment would be. Sure, you can get away with making whatever you want because you don't have the same sort of budgetary limitations, but there's just something to be said for seeing this kind of crazy horror brought to you in our reality in the 3rd dimension. The first reason I think Dead Space would make a great live-action movie is because it combines the survival horror aspects of Resident Evil, or even Doom 3, with the story quite similar to one of my favorite sci-fi horror movies, Event Horizon. The story has the isolation and flavor of space horror films like Alien, while at times having the awesome sci-fi action vibe of, well, aliens. Isaac Clarke is an interesting enough protagonist to carry a story, and enough of an everyman to be relatable to your average movie-going audience. Add to that the fantastic creature designs, and you have the makings of some excellent effects and scares, provided they're done correctly. That is to say, largely practically, if possible. While I'm more forgiving to certain CGI monsters than others, I still agree that there's simply nothing better than a good practical effects monster. And the necromorphs lend themselves to what would likely amount to CGI-enhanced practical effects. The necromorph suits could be all fantastic makeup effects and suits, while their attacks and lurching limps might need some CG assistance in order to look as menacing as they really should. The other main reason this game sticks out as needing a live-action version are the goddamn amazing weapons! One in particular, if I'm honest. The Miner's Plasma Cutter gun tool is such a cool, unique design in the horror or even action genres. It's a gun that essentially fires beams of plasma, perfect for shearing off limbs of attacking necromorphs. And not only that, but the damn thing has a rotation function, so now you can cut on either an X or a Y axis. Talk about having the best tools to disassemble your enemies. Now just imagine that in a live action flick. Sure, the beams will need to be CGI, but after watching Phase 3 of the Marvel movies, I think effects houses can pull it off at this point. The bottom line is, there are plenty of reasons why Dead Space deserves a live-action treatment. But like I said earlier, there is only one inherent risk, and that's that we might end up with another Doom.
I'm not supposed to die!
So what do you get when you combine the newer, action-oriented gameplay style of the recent Resident Evils with a noir detective story, monsters, The Matrix, and a little dash of Inception? Well, all of that amounts to 2014's The Evil Within. The Evil Within tells the story of Sebastian Castellanos, a grizzled detective that years earlier lost his daughter in a house fire before losing his wife to an unexplained disappearance. One day, Sebastian, his partner, and junior detective Kidman are called to investigate a mass murder at the local mental hospital. It's not long before all three are pulled into an insane alternate reality created by a seemingly superpowered psycho called Ruvik. Ruvik powers this world using a machine of his own invention called STEM, which connects living individuals to a shared consciousness run by a hive mind called the Core. Inside this world, Ruvik creates terrifying creatures to torture our trio that are all drawn from their worst fears. Even worse than that, Ruvik soon becomes powerful enough to not only manipulate and physically change the world they're existing in, but to eventually control the trio's minds as well. From there, it's up to Sebastian to discover Ruvik's motivations and ultimately put a stop to him and all of his monsters. Now, in my opinion, the best film would be made just from the first half of this game. There's a certain point that feels like a solid ending of the story, then it continues on. But that point, and everything that comes before, is pretty much a perfectly paced plot for a film. There's an arc for all three protagonists, and an arc for the villain as well, which is more than we can say for loads of video game antagonists out there. And frankly, the second half of the game's story could function as the film's sequel anyway. So there are actually quite a few reasons why I think this game would make for an outstanding film. First off, the characters are actually interesting, and there are stakes to the story. Sebastian isn't just another rote protagonist with a bland background. He's fleshed out, tormented, and interesting to watch as the story unfolds. Next, the villain. Ruvik is essentially the Matrix's Agent Smith mixed with Albert Wesker from the Resident Evil franchise, with a dash of Frankenstein added to his appearance. And as I mentioned, he's actually got a story arc as well. So he's not your typical mustache-twirling baddie, but rather he's got deep personal reasons for doing what he's doing. Another reason it would work as a film is the action-oriented style. There's loads of gunplay, which only escalates as the game progresses and you find newer, more badass weapons to use, also like the Resident Evil franchise. Now, if you're curious as to why I keep making connections and comparisons to the Resident Evil series, it's quite simple. The Evil Within was created by Shinji Mikami, who also created the Resident Evil franchise. After that franchise sort of lost its way, then found its way, then lost its way again before only recently finding its way again, so Mikami was looking to create something a bit different. An even gorier descent into horror. And trust me, this game is gory, which, along with the game's monsters, are the final reasons why I think it would make for a fantastic film adaptation. The carnage candy. I mean, just look at some of this. And some of the monster designs are just unbelievable. I mean, I'd absolutely love to see the nightmarish, multi-armed Laura, or the crazy safe-head killer called the Keeper, brought to life. Laura is a disturbing, nigh unkillable force that shows up numerous times, a la Nemesis in Resident Evil 3, and the Keeper is an intimidating presence with a totally unique design that sticks with you. Having him chase after victims with his abnormally large hammer would be a thrill in a film, the same way it was whenever Pyramid Head showed up in the Silent Hill games. If they can translate even a fraction of that crazy awesomeness to the big screen for a deep R rating, then the movie would be a success based on that alone. But for now, all of this remains nothing but a pipe dream. Or a bathtub dream. You know what I mean. The next game I'd love to see made into a live-action movie is the one that I was kind of alluding to at the top of this episode. This is the one that anyone trying to make into a movie would likely run into the most rights issues of any of the properties that we've talked about. And that's 2000's American McGee's Alice. American McGee's Alice is not a story for anyone expecting the admittedly still dark, but not quite as dark, Disney version of the classic tale, Alice in Wonderland. It's much more insane. Literally. Alice is in the mental ward. But let me explain. This even darker twist on C.S. Lewis's novel, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, begins in the mid-1800s, with a young girl named Alice who is asleep while her cat knocks over a lantern, causing a fire to blaze and quickly spread throughout her house, ultimately trapping her parents in their room and consuming them. Alice's mind is fractured by the traumatizing events, and she is put into the Rutledge Mental Asylum. Essentially comatose, Alice remains in a catatonic state for years, until one day her stuffed white rabbit calls to her for help. Alice follows the rabbit's voice deep into her psyche, where she keeps a version of Wonderland that is now as broken as her mind. From there, Alice quickly learns that the Queen of Hearts is driving Wonderland into decline and that she is to be the champion who defeats her. Her quest begins, which has her running into all the familiar characters we know from the story, but each a distorted, almost funhouse mirror version of themselves due to Alice's fractured psyche. But it's not long into her journey that she learns she'll have to defeat many of the Queen's malicious forces, including the monstrous Jabberwock himself, before she'll even have a chance at Alice's main antagonist. But once she gets that chance, she must battle the Queen in order to regain her sanity itself. So there are a lot of reasons why I think this would make for a great live-action horror film. The first of which being we already know the base story that has proven to be both effective and popular, considering there have been more than a few live-action interpretations of the original property up to this point. What's great about American McGee's Alice is, of course, the dramatic shift into a more horrific telling of the story. That means we'd usually get all the same wild imagery that we're used to with the Alice movies, except that it would all be even more ramped up and heightened due to it being a broken version of this world we've seen before. I mean, just look at how some of these areas of Wonderland have been transformed and are nowhere near as welcoming as the areas presented in the original Disney movie or even the recent, more adult Tim Burton version. I mean, frankly, it's a production designer's dream to be able to craft a horrific, twisted version of Wonderland. The next reason it would be a great film is the dark story itself. The stakes are immediately higher than they've ever been with any Alice telling I've ever seen before. And it actually makes sense as compared to a perfectly mentally healthy girl traveling to a mysterious Wonderland that she must eventually escape from. The fractured psyche aspect of the story makes it immediately engaging and would allow for fun storytelling moments where you can mess with the audience because it all technically takes place in Alice's broken brain. One other thing I'd be excited about is the Hollywood budgeted costuming for the characters. Each and every character has a cool, unique, and dark look to them, and seeing an excellent costume designer's take on them would be tremendous, especially when considering we'd finally get a big budget interpretation of the now flat out iconic look for Alice herself. Cosplays are nice, and some can surpass the actual films at times, but this outfit is just too badass not to get the Hollywood treatment. Finally, the Jabberwock. As an admitted creature feature horror, I can't tell you how excited I'd be to see this big dragon creature brought to screen. Quite frankly, that was my favorite part in the Tim Burton movie just because of that. But after seeing it, I want more. Imagine if it was a big badass live action throwdown between Alice and the Jabberwock a la Smaug and Bard the Bowman, only at a much closer range. I would be all in on that. And don't act like you wouldn't be too, you liars. Okay, after all that dreariness, it's time to ratchet things up a bit. The next game on the list is definitely chock full of horror elements and story beats, but at its core, it is another action game. But not your typical hack and slash action game that a lot of horror games were leaning into at the time. No, this one focused on vehicular action. That's right, I'm talking about 2001's Twisted Metal Black. So the story of Twisted Metal Black is basically the same as a number of the Twisted Metal games. A mysterious figure named Calypso shows up to a bunch of random people, some good but most bad, and offers them their heart's desire if they win the vehicular combat tournament known as Twisted Metal. But Black made one key change that turned the series sharply into horror rather than simply fantastical car combat. In this game, Calypso goes straight to the Blackfield Mental Asylum to get his combatants, and each of them has a more appropriately, twisted story than the previous one. You have the preacher who believes himself to be possessed by a demon he exorcised from a baby before destroying his church and everyone in it. Then Calypso shows up and offers him the truth if he wins the tournament. But once he does, the preacher learns that there's actually no demon. He just went crazy and killed the baby and everyone at its baptism. Then there's Bloody Mary, who had a crush on a boy as a little girl, but was rebuffed. She continued this way throughout her life, getting more and more angry about being rejected, and eventually lashing out at a friend's wedding and killing everyone there. So she was thrown into the asylum. Then Calypso shows up and says if she wins, he'd tell her where to find her true love. When she wins, Calypso delivers a man who has been lobotomized, so she kills him too, swearing to go through one man at a time until she finds the right one for her, from now until eternity. And then there's my absolute favorite character in the game, Sweet Tooth. Sweet Tooth was a serial murderer with a clown motif that was eventually, after a massive slaughter, caught and sentenced to the chair. He fries, and a familiar preacher curses him, asking God to burden him with flames forever. From then on, his head burned and burned without ceasing. But when he wins the tournament, Calypso offers him a vial, explaining that the fluid inside will stop the curse. But if he ever goes back to killing, the curse will return. So Sweet Tooth smashes the vial, knowing where his priorities lie, starting with Calypso. Now that's some dark stuff. And that's just a few of the roster of more than 10 characters, with each and every one of the stories ending in some kind of dark way. But that also leads me to how I think this can work as a movie. As I revisited the game for this video, I learned what I'd clearly forgotten. This game centers mostly around Sweet Tooth. Yes, there are many characters you can take control of, but even besides Sweet Tooth himself, there are a number of characters with direct ties to him. The preacher, for example, who cursed him. Another character, Dollface, was trapped in her mask by the man that actually made Sweet Tooth's mask. Then there's Yellow Jacket, driven by Sweet Tooth's brother, Charlie Kane, and his son. With all of these ties, you can make a legitimately interesting film that centers on an anti-hero. It is getting more and more common nowadays. Why not tell that story? Especially if you can actually tie a number of the other characters into the lead's plot. Frankly, that's already more well-crafted than a lot of the dreck that gets translated into theatrical experiences. So obviously I think the story of the game would translate well into a film. But obviously with Twisted Metal, there's another big piece that would need to be adapted: the car combat. And for that, I'm thinking it would be awesome if a movie just leaned heavily into it, Death Race style. I mean, Blood Drive got away with this, and it aired on Sci-Fi. Make it big, make it bombastic, make it Fast and Furious levels of silly. Okay, maybe not that silly, but you get my point. With the plethora of ways we now know we can film car chase sequences, that knowledge could be easily applied to big budget car combat sequences. And think about it, this really is just a giant gladiatorial battle, but on wheels. And people love watching gladiator fights and car wrecks. So why not combine them? And since it's going to be a horror movie, lean into the graphicness of the violence. Additionally, I'd love to see big budget treatments of what the characters and their vehicles would look like in real life. Each and every character has an interesting look, and each and every car would be a marvel to behold in live action, let alone driving around blowing each other up. This is where the film could have a good amount of fun, introducing each driver the same way they introduced characters in Suicide Squad, except have them all around their vehicles as our main character strolls through the field of contestants heading towards his car. It would allow a brief spotlight on each person and their ride before we immediately start picking them off during the action. I'm sure I could think even harder and come up with more reasons why Twisted Metal Black would make for a good horror film, but I'm pretty sure I've covered plenty. I mean, what more do you people want? An effed up story and vehicular carnage candy? That's a win-win. So to clarify, how much do I love Twisted Metal Black and want it to be made into a live-action horror movie?
This much. Now shut up and bleed, you motherfucker.
Please, no, I got a family.
Shut up and bleed, you motherfucker.
So when I began writing this episode, the horror game that I now have at number 1 was sitting at number 2 for quite a while. But honestly, by the time I got around to it, and as much as I love Twisted Metal Black and think it would make for a great horror film, I think this video game would just be way more inspired and interesting and would just straight up kick ass for anyone that wanted to see a good, intelligently crafted horror film. And that's 2010's Alan Wake. After years of standard horror games that all essentially functioned like one another, and with few variations, the horror gaming landscape started to get stale. Occasionally, you had a studio wanting to try something different with their game. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, for one. But for the most part, the games were all getting to be pretty cookie cutter. There was basically your survival horror and your action horror options. But then in 2010, Alan Wake was unleashed on the world. And even though it was still a blending of survival and action horror, it went about it in ways that few other games at the time were attempting to. Focusing on story, interesting and new mechanics, story, solid gunplay, and, oh yeah, story. To that end, Alan Wake tells the story of titular Alan, a crime fiction novelist that has been suffering from writer's block for almost 2 years. Alan's wife Alice arranges a trip to Bright Falls, a small town in Washington, after Alan's friend and agent Barry suggests it. When they arrive, Alan finds out his wife arranged for him to see a psychologist to try and help break the writer's block, and he gets upset. After he storms out, though, he hears Alice scream and comes running just in time to see her get dragged into a nearby lake by a mysterious force. After diving in to try and save her, Alan blacks out, waking up a week later. He finds out that he supposedly drove his car off the road and blacked out after the accident. From that point, Alan tries to locate his wife while also solving the mysteries of Bright Falls, including discovering the pages of a book he has no memory of writing that is foretelling the events that he is currently experiencing. In addition to that, the malevolent force starts sending shadow figures to try and take out Alan, his only recourse being to use his flashlight to weaken them before destroying them. Eventually, Alan has to figure out not only what happened to his wife, but if anything he's been experiencing is actually real or if it's all in his head. In actuality, however, the dark presence is revealed to have forced Alan to write the book during his missing week, and is now trying to use the writings to escape the lake where it's been trapped for many years, called the Dark Place. It's doing so by reaching out and causing havoc in the town by influencing certain people to do bad things. Eventually, Alan is able to defeat the Dark Presence by destroying the force inside the lake, but he realizes there must be balance, so even though he's able to free Alice, he's forced to stay behind in the Dark Place. So this is another example of the game's story being the primary reason why I think it would make for a great movie. The game makers themselves have confirmed that Alan Wake was inspired by both Stephen King and The Twilight Zone, so they crafted a story that would be at home in either universe. Luckily for us, it's a very engaging tale, one with twists and turns that you aren't expecting throughout the campaign. The amazing mystery deepens repeatedly and makes for a very engaging story while you're playing, and I don't think that would change if made into a film. In fact, the amount of mystery and intrigue in the story would make for just the same in a film, I'd imagine. The amount of cool reveals means there are a number of beats you can set up in the film's script that you're paying off at a good pace, ensuring the story keeps moving and that the audience never gets bored. The locations and production design would be huge draws visually as well. Washington is a gorgeous state, and the life-affirming greens are all well and starkly offset by the darkness and shadows of Alan Wake's world. Plus, there are the shadow creatures that attack Alan regularly. Those would be really cool to see on the big screen as well. And that brings us to the other reason I've always wanted to see this in the theaters: the flashlight mechanic. I always enjoyed that aspect of the game because it was unique, and it would work hand in hand with the production design and art department. Seeing our lead character in the flesh face down intimidating creatures of shadow with a flashlight would be an awesome sight, I'd wager. If you got the right digital artists, each time a shadow creature would hit the flashlight, you could have them writhe around rapidly via CGI before exploding off of their hosts. It would look amazing on film. So with the right ingredients, Alan Wake could be a true force to be reckoned with at the box office. There just needs to be someone in Hollywood brave enough to shine a light on this overlooked gem. So that's going to do it for my top 6 horror video games that absolutely need film adaptations. Let me know in the comments down below if you agree with my choices, if you've never heard of my choices, what other choices you might have, and also while you're down there, let me know if you enjoyed the style of this video. It's something I can really kind of only do for video games because it's a lot more lenient as far as copyright goes than movie footage is. So if you do like it, let me know, and I do have another 6 horror video games all picked out and ready to go for an episode 2 of this series if you guys like it. So if so, let me know in those comments down below. While you're down there, again, please click the like button and subscribe. Click that notification bell to make sure you don't miss an episode 2 of this series if you want to see it. I greatly appreciate your guys coming by and watching. Thank you very much. And if you're so inclined, there is a link in the description box to our Patreon as well. Through that link, you can tell us movies to either review or do commentaries for. Lots of options on there. Thanks again, guys. I've been Cecil Laird, and remember, stay scared.